right, I think we have a few more people logging in. I can see a couple people coming in, and we'll give them a few more minutes. But I think in the interest of time, it might be best that we get going. Anyway, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our presentation on a very interesting topic beyond traditional customer satisfaction surveys. My name is Rodley Raphael, and I'm the President of Research and Insights for QuestionPro Audience. I want to take a few seconds to talk about QuestionPro Audience. We're the research and data collection division within QuestionPro that specializes in developing and managing niche panel communities, giving our clients access to more than 20 million respondents online across the globe. We have thousands of clients who are using our software product or sampling services in some capacity or another. So in essence, this is a topic we're very familiar with. While we do understand the significance of customer satisfaction surveys and the role they play in driving business growth, we're also aware that there are some fundamental issues as it relates to how we measure satisfaction. The main problem, as our speaker will address, is that companies that conduct customer sat are often focused on how customers feel regarding a particular product or service, rather than understanding the customer's expectation of the company. Our presentation today by no means implies that customer satisfaction should be abolished, but we're simply presenting an alternative lens to how we look at them, particularly when analyzing those metrics. Today's presentation will focus on why customer sat metrics are inadequate, the two types of customer expectation, how to use expectations to create surveys that outperform traditional satisfaction surveys. So first, it's a pleasure for me to introduce our guest speaker for today's presentation. Bill's career has been marked by the invention of many widely used business models and research methods. With over 30 years of industry experience, Bill is co-founder and senior partner of Promising Outcome and perhaps the leading practitioner of expectations theory, which underlies Promising Outcomes approach and its innovative tools and methods. He's a globally recognized authority in performance measurement and is considered the father of the Dynamic Scorecard, a popular alternative to the Balanced Business Scorecard. He has authored many business-related articles in the book From Manager to Innovator, using information to become an idea entrepreneur. He earned an MBA from the Yale School of Management, and something that I give him a lot of slack about. This is a joke between me and him. But without further delay, I would like to welcome my colleague and good friend, Bill FONVIELLE, as our esteemed guest speaker. Welcome, Bill, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Ridley. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be with you today and speak to what I think is an important topic. As you and your audience know, customer satisfaction has just been a dominant concept and a metric in marketing and market research since at least the early 1950s. And it's been around for a very long time. It's had a long play, but we see that as a metric, it's kind of going away. It's slow but persistent. In saying this, I want to point out that such measures are not going to disappear overnight. They remain largely popular with a lot of market researchers and major corporations and small companies. They remain useful for transactional and point of sale surveys, and we see them used in large reputational surveys such as the American Customer Satisfaction Index and the J.D. Power surveys. And these are not going to go away anytime soon. And in terms of looking at the respective reputations of both companies and whole industries, they certainly play an important role in our business life. We can certainly ask why we are seeing a diminution, nonetheless, in the use of customer satisfaction measures. And one bit of evidence actually my eyes were opened some years ago when I was sort of first got into this field, and I was commissioned to do a survey of banking customers on the West Coast. We had 4,000 responses to the survey, looking at service attributes of the major banks that were resident in California at the time. And I was put in an overall question about service quality, and I also included an overall question about customer satisfaction. And when I looked at the results, I discovered something to me that was kind of amazing. And this was that almost everyone who said that they were satisfied, either highly satisfied or somewhat satisfied with the vendor in question, also said that they were satisfied, and I'm sorry, also rated service quality high. So it seemed as though there was almost a one-to-one correspondence there. However, when I looked at those who said service quality was poor, 40% of that group also said they were satisfied. So these were customers who were potential defectors, who could probably be easily swayed to go to a competitor. And these were customers who were invisible to the customer satisfaction question. So this raised a big question mark in my mind about what this meant and what might be behind it. One of the reasons that I think the customer satisfaction metric is slipping is what I noted in effect, and that it doesn't really predict customer loyalty, because there's that group of customers who will say they were satisfied almost no matter what. And this was borne out in an iconic Harvard Business Review article some years ago that basically noted that satisfied customers often defect. This was written by Thomas Jones and Errol Sasser Jr., distinguished professors and researchers. They found almost no difference in defections between extremely satisfied banking customers and unsatisfied customers. So this supported the research that I did, and many others have come along and replicated that kind of result. So if it doesn't really predict customer loyalty, perhaps it's not as useful as we might think it is as a measure. Looking more broadly at the question of customer satisfaction, we think that it doesn't really inform strategy very much, and I'll touch on this later. Because it works best in transactional settings, if you've gone to a website and you get a quick survey and it says, could you understand what was on the screen? You could, were you satisfied with how the screen looked? You could say you were or you weren't, but whatever the result that would come from that really wouldn't help you strategize. It might help you in terms of improving the website, but it's not going to give you a big picture look. We found also that improvements in satisfaction scores are often not sustainable. And I first came on this through anecdotal evidence. I kept hearing stories of CEOs who would invest in customer satisfaction surveys. They would get their score. They would say, okay, we could do better, or maybe they'd say we're doing pretty well already. But if they thought that improvement was necessary, they would set goals, and which were often rather arbitrary. And they might see, they would invest in improvements in areas where satisfaction was low. And they might have, they would often see short-term gains. That over the course of a couple of years, their satisfaction scores would go up, and then they would plateau. And despite continued and even greater investment in improvements, I wouldn't see scores budge very much. It was almost as though there was some kind of a ceiling network, and they didn't know why. We think we know why, but again, we'll maybe raise that issue later. And also, at this stage, improvement goals are largely arbitrary. Customer satisfaction measures are generally presented as percentages of respondents who are satisfied and highly satisfied. And So what kind of a goal are you going to set? So say that you are at 68% of customers who are satisfied or very satisfied, which is not an unusual result. What are you going to set as a goal? Say 72%? So if you do that, you're setting a goal that means that you are dissatisfied 18% of your customers. Is that really a goal that you want to set? And furthermore, can you like put that on a flag and raise the banner for employees and say, hey, we got to get 4% better here. We're going to get satisfied 72 or 75% of our customers. So that's kind of, we're going to charge up San Juan Hill and take the summit of 75% satisfaction. Not likely to inspire your workforce. So in terms of long-term improved business results, you don't really necessarily see it. We think that the customer satisfaction metric only encompasses part of the customer experience and perhaps misses the most important parts. And in addition to all of this, as Wedley put a slide up earlier that said, what is customer satisfaction? Well, we find in the literature that the research people and the writers and the academics don't really agree on a definition. You can look at Wikipedia, you can look wherever you want to look, and you'll see that the definition that they seem to agree on is a process definition and not a substance definition. And it's rather like, pardon me, it's rather like United States Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart sort of famously described his test for obscenity in an important case. And he basically said, I don't really know how to define obscenity or pornography, but I know it when I see it. And it's a little the same with customer satisfaction. We don't really kind of know what it is in any meaningful sense, but I think a lot of people would say, well, we know it when we see it. So this all stems from what I would call the original theory of customer satisfaction. As I noted, in the early days, if you look at the early literature on customer satisfaction, and even more recent literature, you'll find that academicians, theorists, serious researchers, all operated from the same model. And the model went pretty much as like this. Customers approach any transaction with a set of expectations. And they then actually have the experience in question. They have this they evaluate the performance that they received against their expectations, resulting in feelings of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And the academics call this process disconfirmation of beliefs. That is, either my belief about what was going to happen happened, or it didn't, and it fell short by some measure, or exceeded it by some measure, what have you. In any event, this tension, this gap between expectations and performance, perceived performance, gave rise to customer satisfaction. And that in turn, hopefully, influenced customer loyalty. Now, we've already talked about how it really doesn't do that very well. But this was the prevailing theory for a great long time. And then something happened. What happened was that market research practitioners, market research departments in large corporations, and others shifted to this model. They decided that so long as we know something about customer satisfaction, we really didn't need to know anything else. So we could go directly from measures of customer satisfaction to some impugn outcome of customer loyalty. And we could kind of forego any thought before that. So this model, I think, is the one that is commonly used when we do customer satisfaction surveys. Now, we have a little different model at Promising Outcomes. Our model is one that restores the tension between customer expectations and perceived performance, but we take customer satisfaction score out of the question because it really isn't needed. Yeah, if you want to, you can always ask the question, how satisfied were you with us overall, or something like that. If it gives you some comfort to have that as a number or percentage, fine, you can certainly ask that. But we really key in on business results. Um, and we do also employee surveys following exactly the same model. And we even look at, use the same process within organizations to look at internal units that provide a service to other units within the organization. It's all kind of the same process. But the outcome that we are interested in is the business result. Um, in our mind, it doesn't matter so much whether customers are satisfied, so long as you have competitive success in the marketplace. And you look at the cable companies, the big dominant cable companies, they get terrible customer satisfaction scores, and they probably wouldn't do very well under our system either. But even though they give great lip service to customer service, at the end of the day, they're getting the financial results that they want. They don't really care. So I think that's kind of the picture of the world as it stands today. We think that the way to really build a good customer survey is to build it around customer expectations. And so I now want to talk a bit about how we do that. We call what we do strategic customer research. And by that, we mean research that, and I'll kind of read this, seeks to understand the customer experience in a competitive environment through the lens of customer expectations and the perceived performance of the client organization with respect to those expectations. So in a sense, we're going back to the original model because we think that was correct. We know that expectations arise in any human encounter, and certainly in situations where we are selling something, where we're offering something, where we are servicing something, customers always come to that transaction with a set of expectations. And by the way, so does the vendor. But for the work that we do, we focus on the customer side and not the expectations of the vendor, although it might behoove companies to occasionally say, well, what are our expectations in the course of doing business with our customers? And maybe we better adjust those in order to meet reality. Now, at this point, it's really important to talk about the two types of expectations. And one of the ways that the early research got muddled, and I think even continues to be muddled, is a failure to understand that there are two very different types of expectations that are at work when customers become your customer and enter into transactions with you. There are what is called predictive expectations, and there's what is called ideal expectations. And simply put, predictive expectations are those that depict what the customer expects will happen, literally the prediction. And this happens all the time. I mean, you walk into the auto dealer, go to the used car dealer, and you know you're going to get a certain type of experience, and it's probably one that you're not going to enjoy, but you put up with it because you really have to. That's the only way you're going to make the transaction. But it's not necessarily a positive thing. The ideal expectation, on the other hand, is what the customer would like to have happen. So from the point of view of a customer, it really defines an attribute or an element of an ideal interaction with the provider and its product or service. And this is a really important distinction. As I noted before, I think researchers would kind of bundle these together under the general heading of expectation. But in fact, the dynamic behind each is a very, very different one. And it is the ideal expectation that we focus. To be sure, it might be interesting and fun to do some surveys that are based on predictive expectations, because these would amount to almost reputational studies of a company. And there would be some value in that. But we are aimed at improving business results for clients. And we think the biggest bang for the buck is looking at what it is the customer would like to have happen in the transaction, and then begin to point our processes, align our employees, and aim our strategy at meeting or exceeding the ideal expectation. So how do we do that? Well, there are 4 major steps in our process. The first is that we simply ask customers what their expectations are. And at its heart, it's really nothing more complicated than that. It turns out that customers are willing to tell you. When I first started to build these methodologies and define this process, I used focus groups and using a method called Nominal Group technique. And Nominal Group technique is one of the new tools of quality, if you're a quality maven. But it came out of a social science environment and was widely employed by city and urban planners back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. It was literally invented in 1952, actually, by a couple of social scientists. And what it does is that it at its beginning phase, it's called nominal group because the individuals in the group work as individuals and not as group members. And the key thing is that you ask them a question, and you ask them to write down their answers to that question on paper, and then to, in a round-robin fashion, give you the responses that they've written down, and with a guideline that they're not to offer an expectation that somebody else has already put up. And then you keep going around until everything's up on flip chart or these days on the computer screen, and then you can have them rate and rank these and do all kinds of exercises with that list. What we discovered fairly early on is that we didn't have to do a lot of those to get at the core expectations. Inevitably, by the time we had conducted 4 focus groups of 8 to 12 people, that by the time we got to a 5th group, we weren't learning anything new. You can think of it as like a Venn diagram with the overlapping circles, and they all overlapped over the core expectations, and these were robust and kind of extended across groups. Everything else was more or less idiosyncratic that you could kind of push to the side because it really wasn't critical. So all of a sudden we had a way now to tease out the expectations. We've done this literally hundreds of times in every kind of environment imaginable. Everything from heavy industry to consumer products to performing arts organizations. One time I actually used it to set guidelines for hiring a new rabbi for a synagogue. It's amazing the flexibility of this tool and the great insights that you get. So that's the first step. I have a database of hundreds of expectations because for every industry, in every situation, it's a little different. There are some expectations that are pretty common. I mean, in situations where you have face-to-face encounters with customers, customers always want to be served by employees who are courteous and knowledgeable. That's just sort of the name of the game. People always want responses to their questions and inquiries promptly, usually within 24 hours or so. Again, these kinds of things are universal. But once you get beyond the 5 or 6 kind of universal ones, there's great variance depending upon the nature of the business. And so when we ask our question, we don't ask it in terms of our client. We don't say, what are your expectations of XYZ company? Because that's kind of limiting. That's putting blinders on. We say, what would you expect ideally from a provider of XYZ industry or XYZ product category? And so that way we get kind of the fuller picture, the kind of universe of customer expectations in a very specific and non-generic way. And this then allows us to build a survey that isn't guesswork in terms of the questions. It is, in fact, what the customers tell us it should be built on. And guess what? This also results in better response rates because when customers start to take the surveys, they see that it's hitting the issues that matter to them as opposed to what might matter to managers in the organization. So then we measure how the level of expectation, we measure the level of performance, and thinking back to the previous chart, that results in a gap. So we measure that gap. What's the gap between the ideal expectation and the perceived performance? And when we do this, we can also toss in competitors. So some of the work we do, we're doing, the social service agency, there aren't necessarily a lot of competitors, but usually our clients have competitors, and we can sort of plot them on the same results. We can ask our client, how well are they performing? And we can ask against each expectation. That's important. And we can ask that of our competitors. How well do the competitors do? It can be a specific competitor, it can be competitors in general, or we often build in a drop down that allows the person to pick a competitor with whom they've had the most experience and respond as well. So all of a sudden we're in a state where we can get considerable insight. Why is this doing things? Well, we would maintain that it captures the true voice of the customer. So the customer determines what the content of the survey is, not management. The implication of this, of course, is that we don't do any off the rack surveys. Everything that we do is entirely customized to that industry. Again, not even to the client specifically, but to the industry in which the client finds itself. So it's customer and not management's idea of what customers should want or should expect. The process pretty much is comprehensive. I mean, we will typically get from our front end work. And by the way, we don't really do focus groups much anymore. We do sometimes, but now we just use online surveys to gather the same expectations data. And ordinarily, we'll find maybe with say 30 to 50 respondents in an online survey, we'll find maybe 200 or so distinct expectations that are voiced from that group. And then we can look at that and see what's common to them, and look at what is most frequently presented. And then we sort of get the critical ones. We can ferret from that data the really critical expectations to focus on. We can also do a second survey to winnow down the field of expectations in a more precise way, but often it isn't really necessary to do that. Once you've got this, and you've got the results, you can now set very precise and customer-centered and indeed measurable improvement goals, because now you can see, well, here's where we are against the ideal expectation. And the goal now is to in fact to meet customers' expectations, and in some cases perhaps exceed them. But we can see and measure precisely where we are in that process. And the reason that customer satisfaction surveys started to fail on an ongoing basis in terms of showing real progress is that what market researchers didn't take into account is that in improving processes and products to improve customer satisfaction, they were really raising the bar. So when we take the expectations approach, we can see where that bar is and how it moves over time. So customers' expectations increased with improved performance, but customer satisfaction surveys weren't able to measure this. We can do that. Our process also means that we can set priorities for improvement in a very scientific and straightforward way. And sometimes, even if our client is not perhaps necessarily performing well in an absolute sense, as you will see, we have a way of determining whether or not they really need to focus attention there. Perhaps they are doing better than competitors. Perhaps they are in something that we call the zone of tolerance, which I'll show you more about in a moment. So when we couple in competitive data with this, we can get really some deep strategic insights. We did surveys over a number of years for a company that was in the laboratory supply business, And what we discovered is that the industry itself is essentially undifferentiated. That all the major competitors were pretty much just like all the other major competitors. Nothing stood out. Nobody stood out. Uh, Performance in any given area didn't stand out. And so here was an ideal opportunity to think about how to differentiate yourself or our client in a way that will allow it to stand out from its competitors and gain some real traction in the marketplace. One of the first times I did this process was for a large magazine publisher, and there was an expectation, an important expectation that emerged from the research that nobody was paying attention to in the industry. Again, another opportunity to differentiate oneself and to stand out from the crowd. So we have tons of examples of this sort, and it's just a way that you can get sort of really insights that can drive the business in a forward-going fashion. So I want to go back to another kind of model and talk about the full customer experience. So again, coming back to expectations, and in this case, we say it's the customer's desired outcomes. And we take the managers out of the picture, and we find that expectations, that ideal expectations, fall into three categories. It looks like there's a little issue on the graphic here, but there, if you see three boxes under expectations, and in fact under both also value and experience. First thing is what it is. So customers have expectations about what it is they receive, be it a product or be it a survey. And then they have expectations about how they receive it, what the sales process was like, what the delivery process was like, etc. And finally, they have expectations about costs. What is it? What do I have to pay for it? And so these are the three key areas of expectations. And this would be true even if we're talking about the predictive expectations. It's just kind of how the world sorts itself out. And so the perceived experience also falls into these three boxes. What did I get? How did I get it? What did it cost me? And it's the gap between the expectations and then the experience that leads to the customer's perception of value. And so we could do a whole webinar on just that perceived value box, and maybe that's something we should do sometime. But the point I want to make here is that if we look at those three boxes of what, how, and cost, that we can break those down into a dimensional structure and even a finer structure than that. So service quality, I want to start with the how, the service quality, because our research indicates that that's really the most critical box. It's not the product, it's not the cost, it is in fact service quality. I did an iconic piece of research back many years ago that looked at 15 companies in both business to business and business to customer businesses, and we discovered that service quality emerged as the most important indicator. In fact, the reason why people would switch from one competitor to another, either B2B or B2C environments, the results were exactly the same in both, was because of something that went wrong with the relationship. 2/3 of the reason for switching had to do with something that went wrong in the relationship, in the how, in the customer, in the service quality side of things, and about 15% each for product quality and cost. And as you see, we've indicated in these three boxes towards the right, some categories of what we would call dimensions. And service quality, those dimensions actually were developed by, originally in some very iconic research done by three marketing professors who at the time were all at Texas A&M University back in the early 80s. And they determined that the service quality had a dimensional structure that included reliability, which is, did you do what you say you were going to do? Assurance, trust and confidence that you inspire in others. tangibles, the physical aspects of service, empathy, can you put yourself in the customer's shoes, or do you put yourself in the customer's shoes and see the world as they do, and responsiveness, providing service promptly. And that dimensional structure has been very well researched, thoroughly tested, it works, it's like real. Product quality uses the structure that we inherited actually from a quality consulting firm. And if we find it works just as well as the service quality side, it's just fine. So grade quality is sort of the intrinsic thing. You look at that Ferrari that has grade quality, it may fall apart in the winter, but it has those aspects that you associate with high quality. Fitness for use, which is really about, does it work as it is intended to work, and conformance to specifications. Does it meet quality standards? Can we actually market this because it meets government regulations, etc.? Cost is our own invention, and again, this sort of works. Price is the sticker, what you shell out for it. Incentives include such things as guarantees, warranties, volume discounts and purchases, and the like. And usage is about total costs over time. If I'm going to own this refrigerator for 10 years, what's going to be the cost to me, not only in terms of the price, but in terms of what it takes to operate it over time. So this is what we would call the 11-dimensional structure of the full customer experience. And I don't know that anybody else has come up with this. So once we go through our initial upfront process, which is essentially a qualitative process to determine what the expectations are, then we can actually create what we call expectation maps. And here we have examples of everything, but you can't really, I think it's going to be really hard for you to read this on the screen. Maybe you can. We have typical expectations under each one. For example, under empathy, be our business partner. That's one that's pretty common. Fitness for use, make it easy to handle. Conformance to specifications, meet industry standards. Price competitively. That's another one that's just, you see again and again and again. People don't say, in general, give me the lowest price. They just want your price to be competitive and for you to deliver value on the other aspects of the experience. And so under assurance, be an industry leader, have the reputation in the industry that makes us proud to do business with you. It's one you might not think about. Reliability, have sufficient goods in stock so that when we run out, you can meet our needs quickly. So, it's this sort of thing. And the maps are really kind of useful for communicating what's important to customers throughout your organization, and also for training purposes. So how do we get this information? Well, we use, once we have the expectations, the list of expectations, we can incorporate that in a survey that may include anywhere from a small number to, I think maybe 24 is probably the most that we've ever had in a survey. And we ask 3 questions, and if we're asking about competitors, we'll ask a 4th question. So the first question of each expectation is, what's the level of performance you would expect of an ideal supplier of XYZ? We use a 7-point scale for this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. We think a 7-point scale is a superior scale. We think that there's some inherent defects in a 10 or 11-point scale, and 5-point scale doesn't give you enough definition. Turns out most people can handle 7, and we think that's sort of a nice compromise. What's the minimum level of performance you would accept from a supplier of sportswear products before you would complain? So that gives us a kind of a bottom baseline. So we have a top baseline, which is the ideal. We have a bottom baseline that is sort of the minimum level expected. Then we say, to what extent does our client perform? And then when we ask the competitor question, which we do most of the time, we'd say, well, to what level does the competitors perform? So on the right, you see how we show this data. And I have not tossed them. So you see a vertical box. The top of the box is the ideal. That's the ideal expectation. The bottom of the box that's the minimum performance that they will accept from you without complaint. And then, again, this is overall in general. So the space in the area in the middle of that, between the high and the low, is called the zone of tolerance. And the zone of tolerance basically means that if your performance is within that zone, it's acceptable to customers. In other words, that's kind of, you might even call that the zone of satisfaction in a way. Customers say, by satisfaction, generally customers say, well, the performance is okay. I was satisfied with it, was okay. And satisfaction doesn't particularly lend itself to very or extremely satisfied, despite the questions that you see in questionnaires. I think people responding to that are answering more about expectations than they are answering about satisfaction. So whatever satisfaction is. So here's a way that you can see what's okay, and the orange dots towards the right are in the okay, but you can also see just how okay they are. They really okay or just sort of okay. So the red dots are red flags, and almost always we'll see 3, 4 red dots for a client. And those are the ones that certainly require some remedial attention, because they're real big warning signs. And of course, that's doubly so if your competitors are in the zone of tolerance and beating you at your game. And on the far right, we have a case where expectations have been exceeded. Now, that raises an interesting question. One is, the question is, are we building great competitive advantage by exceeding expectations, or are we over investing and performing? Maybe we'd be okay if we were just within the zone. And interesting enough, we can kind of figure that out. So if you take the second zone of tolerance there, with the red dot beneath it, you see that that's not very big. When it's not very big like that, it suggests that the expectation is part of what you basically have. It's part of the basic blocking and tackling, as we say, to use an American football analogy. It's what you have to do to stay in business. It's those areas where customers may not particularly reward you or praise you for exceptional performance, but if you screw up, you're dead in the marketplace. On the other hand, the deeper ones, the larger ones, like the first one there, are areas where customers would sort of give you more slack if you don't perform well, even if you're below the line. And so this is an area that maybe you can play around with, see if you can get to be really innovative, and provide some bells and whistles that competitors aren't, but they're not going to determine the future of your company in the marketplace, unlike the second one there. So that's kind of what we do. And again, when we do competitors, we just use a different colored dot and we plot that against everything that you see here. And bingo, you have a really neat, easy to understand, easy to react to picture of where you stand. And we have some other really innovative gee whiz type exhibits that I'm not going to show you today in the interest of time. Except this one. So we want to know, in fact, what drives loyalty. And this is actually kind of a real example. One of the messages here, and you don't see the numbers behind this, but it turned out that in terms of influencing the willingness to recommend question, which we use as a surrogate for customer loyalty, as do others and have done so for many years, that the service quality aspects were about twice as important in influencing that recommendation as were the product quality expectation and performances. So that, again, we see that ratio. And when we go and get expectations, we gather expectations from clients, again, regardless of industry, service business, business, product business, I should say, we see that, again, about 2/3 of expectations are all about the service quality area. It's almost looks like it's a law of nature. So here's a case where we took all the items and all the performance items in the questionnaire, and we did a factor analysis or discriminant analysis, whatever you want to call it, and sorted out, if you will, kind of new dimensions based upon the responses to the survey. And this is what sort of emerged. These are all sort of critical factors and critical expectations driving performance. I want to say a word about the recommend question, I think we bypassed a slide that talked about Net Promoter Score, NPS, as being an example of moving away from customer satisfaction measurement to something else. And I would just want to issue a warning that about Net Promoter Score. I personally think that it is very inferior for a number of reasons. That's a whole nother webinar subject. I'd be happy to do that one. But one of my knocks on that is just the question itself. And under Net Promoter Score questions, the question is how likely would you be to recommend the client to a friend or colleague? And we think likely is, again, involving prediction. And that kind of worries us because I may be perfectly happy to recommend, but I might never see myself in a situation where I would recommend because my friends are not my colleagues or my business partners or what have you. And so I could say, no, I'm not going to recommend. It's not very likely, but boy, I would be willing to if the circumstances arose. So we just that one little word change we think makes a difference. Okay, moving ahead and concluding, if I leave you with a single impression, a single message outside of expectations as supplanting customer satisfaction, it's this. And that is to go to the customer to find out what you need to find out about. You make certain that what your customer wants are truly that, and not merely what some people in the company think the customers want. Garbage in, garbage out. For all the years we've been in business, we've seen too many cases where internal market research departments go to their managers and say, what do you want to ask about? And we just think that is wrong-headed and will ultimately lead you astray because it doesn't really hit what matters to the customer. We think finding out their expectations is the way to go. And on that, I will say sayonara.
All right. Hey, Bill, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I'm sure our audience, and hope that our audience gathered a lot from it. I think we went the full distance a little bit here, but we have some time to take a few questions. We have a lot of questions coming. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to address them, but one thing we can certainly do, we have the slide for anyone that may have questions for myself or Bill. You can obviously forward those questions to me and Bill in the event that we're not able to get to you. Let me go through a series of things and I'll try to make sense of them. One, asking about what type of questions do you suggest we ask using your model? I guess the person is probably asking you for a certain type of examples of the type of questions that you would typically ask in a survey for customer sat, rather than.
Sure, it goes back to a couple of slides that I showed,
Mm-hmm.
And one is that we want the questions to come from the customer. In effect, we use our format for surveys is invariably the same, but the content is always different. The content is always unique to the industry and to the customers in that industry. Mm-hmm. And so once we have their expectations and we know what the key ones are, what the critical ones are, what the big ones are, then we've got the fodder for the questionnaire. And then we use what's called the ServQual method. This comes from the service quality theorists to whom I referred earlier. And that is we ask questions about the expectations. What would your ideal expectation be?
Okay.
What's your minimum level of performance that you would accept? How well are we doing? And that then allows us to plot out the responses, we think, in very useful and graphic ways.
Another question I'm seeing here is this person seems to have a budget, for the year, doing customer satisfaction research for their organization, but they're asking, are customer satisfaction results based on what you're seeing deceiving?
Well, I think they can be deceiving. It like anything else, it depends on how well you execute. But again, yes, I think as I cited when I did my banking research, there was a hole there that you could not, if you had only asked about customer satisfaction, you would never know what was missing. That was a conventional customer satisfaction survey, by the way. This was sort of before I developed all these methodologies. But I was interested in comparing service quality responses to satisfaction responses. So I threw that in. I don't think the client was particularly aware of that, but I had my own set of research in mind, and I made this discovery, which then others replicated and have written articles about Harvard Business Review, et cetera, and many other articles in various journals have found the same thing.
Okay.
So yes, it can mislead.
It can mislead. I'm going to rush to a few questions here because we're running out of time slightly. But one question here is, how do you combine the customer experience with your customer expectation model? They seems to intersect at some point. That's what this user is saying.
Yeah, well, I would say that our model is derived from the customer experience model. It's looking at the key element of expectations and performance. And what we did was just to take the satisfaction element out of it, because not because we had to, but because it really didn't seem necessary. And again, you can, there's no harm in asking if your boss says, well, I want to know customer satisfaction score. You can toss in an overall customer satisfaction question. You can say, okay, this is what we got, and then forget about it, go about the rest of your work.
Good. So here's another one. Jamie said earlier, you mentioned that the rating scale questions, or perhaps that's what you intended to say, the rating scale questions should be somewhat thrown at the window. And then later on, you were showing an example of the rating scales questions where you're just showing the level of scales, or where you're combining something else. I think the user might have been confused about how you're using the rating scales and what you're really promoting as it relates to the rating scale type questions you use.
Oh, well, as I said, we use, these are all kind of Likert type scales. And we settled on a 1 to 7 rating system. And that's because you have a mid, right? You can go 3, and Well, yeah, it does have a mid, which personally I like. Right. People used to say, well, you use an even number, and then you force them one way to another. And I don't want to force my respondents to do something that they might not want to do. Right. So yeah, there is a midpoint. We don't put anchor labels on any of the points except for the extreme ends. So that they're like bipolar scales in that sense. And these are all, there's psychometric reasons for all this. Psychometrically, we know that people can handle, in general, the average person can handle a 7-point scale. And 10-point scale, you're asking people to make finer divisions than they often feel comfortable making. And so you have a preponderance of 8s and 7s, for example, and that sort of a scale that's disproportional. The Net Promoter Score actually uses an 11-point scale. They disguise that by having it 0 to 10, but that's 11 points, and that's we think that's even worse. So we wouldn't do that. And the only reason why they do that is that they can kind of break it out into these 3 big groups of of acolytes and rioters and the great unwashed middle, which have no scientific basis whatsoever. And it's derived using what we think are psychometrically inferior scales. So, again, that's another webinar. Right. I hope the question. I'm not sure if I did. I think you did. I think I get the picture. We're running a little bit out of time, and I want to personally thank you again, Bill, for taking the time to share your experience with us. There's obviously, this is a very broad topic, and there are a lot of segments we can extrapolate and make different webinars out of. And obviously, this is not the end of it. And again,
Thanks to our attendees who took the time to listen to our presentation. We would like to adjourn at this point, and anyone who didn't have the opportunity or would like to see the presentation online, it will be available probably tomorrow or maybe this afternoon. You can download it if you want to see the slides, and of course my contact and Bill's contact will be available in the event that you have some questions. Again, thanks to everyone for attending our webinar on a very important and intriguing topic. Thanks again, Bill.
And thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to the audience.
Okay. Bye now.